In the last two lectures, we discussed how leaders can motivate their followers effectively. Now we turn in the next two lectures to the topic of power. For leaders to be successful, they must exercise the judicious use of power. And that leads us to three interesting questions for this lecture. First, what are the sources of power for a leader? Second, how does a leader acquire or lose power? And we'll close by looking at the age-old question, does power corrupt? When we think about power in politics and organizations, we often become uncomfortable, and some people have a very negative view of it. But Joseph Bauer, the author of a very famous book on the resource allocation process within organizations, put it best when he said, politics is not pathology, it is a fact of large organization. That is to say, whether we like it or not, politics and the exercise and use of power are fundamental. They exist throughout organizations of all sizes and types. And we have to learn to use power in politics effectively rather than being worried and try to run away from it. Fundamentally, I'm going to argue that organizations are political entities, whether we like it or not. You know, Norton Long once wrote, people will readily admit that governments are organizations. But the converse, that organizations are governments, is equally true but rarely considered. We don't want to talk about organizations as political entities, and even as leaders sometimes we don't like discussing our use of power. Rosabeth Moss Kanter, famous scholar of change and leadership, and one of my colleagues when I taught at Harvard once wrote, power is America's last dirty word. It is easier to talk about money and much easier to talk about sex than it is to talk about power. Rosabeth is definitely correct. People don't like talking about it, not just executives. My students often cringe when discussing the exercise of power. They view it in a very negative light. What do I mean by power? How do most people define it? Well, many scholars define it rather simply. They argue that it's to get people to do things that they would not otherwise do. Fundamentally, they describe it as a process of influence, which may or may not be rooted in formal authority. Often we think about power in terms of people who hold formal roles, who are at the top of a hierarchy. But as we'll learn, power can be exercised by many people at many levels, and that leaders don't have to hold formal authority to have power and influence. That's a critical idea that will run throughout this lecture. Now, Jeffrey Pfeffer is perhaps one of the most famous scholars in the area of power and politics and organization. He's an organizational behavior professor at Stanford, and he's written much about the fact that there is a certain ambivalence about power. And throughout the next two lectures, we'll draw on some of his work. Others have confirmed this notion that there is a certain ambivalence about power on the part of many people. Gantz and Murray are two scholars who published a series of studies on politics and power in organizations. They surveyed many executives. Most people that they talked to and interviewed and surveyed felt that successful executives certainly have to be good politicians. But slightly more than half of their respondents said that politics harms efficiency, and nearly half said top managers should be trying to rid organizations of politics rather than encouraging its proper use. Another thing that causes ambivalence about power is the fact that many of the tactics associated with the exercise of power or the use of politics sometimes can be used for evil or negative purposes. The very same tactics that sometimes are used to achieve good or desirable results. The fact that the same tactic can be used either for desirable or very undesirable results seems to bother many people. And lastly, of course, Jeffrey Pfeffer has pointed out that we learn certain early life lessons as children. We learn, most of us do at least, that success is about individual ability and effort, or at least we want to believe that. In fact, we cling to that belief throughout our lives. We'd like to believe we're in a meritocratic society, that getting into college is a meritocracy, that the workplace is a meritocracy. Whether that's true or not is sort of irrelevant. We cling to the belief that individual ability and effort are driving success. And once we start to discuss political behavior, we view that as the antithesis of meritocracy. that, oh, someone got ahead by politics, not by merit. And that really concerns us. Power, though, is an important way that leaders get things done. They really can get things done in three different ways. One, they can get it done by hierarchy and formal authority. Right? They can create an organizational structure, and through those reporting relationships, they can sort of direct people to do certain work. Leaders can get things done in a different approach as well. They can use shared vision and a strong culture to help get people to do what they'd like them to do. And lastly, they can exercise power and influence. And that's really where we want to focus in these next two lectures. What are the sources of a leader's power? Perhaps the most impactful article on sources of power was written by scholars French and Rabin many decades ago. They identified five fundamental sources of power: reward power, coercive power, legitimate power, expert power, and referent power. What does it mean for power to be exercised because of coercion? Well, that's getting people to do something against their will. I mean, think of it as government or the police getting us to do certain things like pay our taxes. There's a certain coercive element there, right? And that certainly is a source of power. We've talked in prior lectures about rewards. Reward power is about using money or other carrots to drive people to do what they might not otherwise do. Legitimate power is about certain roles or positions being able to allow us to get people to do things. That by holding a certain role or position, people respect us and will do what we ask of them, whether that's a CEO or a president or some other person who holds a particular title. Referent power is when someone likes you or wants to be like you, and therefore you can compel them to act in certain ways. Charismatic leaders in many ways are using referent power. People are attracted to them and therefore will follow them. And lastly, there's expert power. That's when you're able to exercise influence because you're viewed as having a great deal of knowledge and expertise, and therefore people will do what you ask of them or what you direct them to do. There are really two main theories that help us understand how power is acquired or lost, and they're somewhat related. In the organizational behavior literature, people talk about social exchange theory. The idea here is that individuals gain or lose power when a group determines that as an individual you have a lot to contribute in terms of your access to data or information or other scarce resources. And also that you have a lot to contribute because of particular skills and capabilities that you might possess. And therefore, they convey upon you certain power because you have something to offer them. There is an exchange there. Strategic contingencies theory is related to this. This argues that subunits of an organization can gain or lose power based on three things. First, if a subunit of an organization has certain unique expertise that can be helpful to others, that conveys upon that unit power. If the unit is central to the overall mission and strategy of the organization, that can convey power upon that unit. And lastly, if there's a certain uniqueness to the capabilities of that unit, if you have to go to that unit in order to achieve certain skills to gain access to certain capabilities, well, that makes that unit more powerful. So power is acquired or lost based on things like unique skills, access to resources, and the like. And that holds true in many different kinds of organizations, not just business organizations. So let's take a look at a case study of a particular leader who gained and accumulated a great deal of power over many decades. He is a wonderful case study of how someone who maybe didn't have the utmost formal authority at first was able to build a tremendous base of power and exercise it to get a lot done. He's a controversial leader in many ways, but a fascinating one to study when we talk about how leaders exercise power. That man is Robert Moses. He was the New York Parks and Bridges Commissioner for many, many years. Moses was never elected to public office. Yet he was incredibly influential. He built bridges and playgrounds and parkways and the like, yet he was not an architect, nor a lawyer, nor a planner, or even really a politician. After all, as I mentioned, he was never elected to public office. In fact, he actually lost by many, many votes when he attempted to run for governor in 1934 in the state of New York. 800,000 votes, in fact. Yet he engaged in a 44-year career. We got an incredible number of complex projects through to completion. According to the New York Times, writing about him upon his death, they said that he had built 658 playgrounds in New York, 416 miles of parkways, 13 bridges, and millions of acres of parks during his career. His key projects included the United Nations headquarters, the Cross Bronx Expressway, the Triborough Bridge, Coney Island Beach, Shea Stadium, and many other parks, bridges, and projects that we all know if we've traveled throughout the metro New York area. But Moses was controversial, to say the least. His projects did build some great landmarks of New York, but they displaced hundreds of thousands of citizens, disrupted small neighborhoods and the like, displaced many people from their homes and many people from the kinds of collective cultural experiences that they had been used to in prior decades. So, many people have written about Moses in a negative way because they don't agree with his philosophy of urban development. Yet as a case study of someone who accumulated a great deal of power and exercised it to get his missions accomplished, he's fascinating. According to the New York Times, from 1924 until 1968, Moses constructed public works in the city and state that in today's terms would cost $27 billion. An unbelievable scale and scope to what he accomplished. How did he do it? That's, of course, a critical question. Sefer writes that Moses understood the truth of the so-called New Golden Rule. The person with the gold makes the rules, wrote Sefer. He realized that various kinds of resources, including allies, are vitally important as sources of power. Money's important, but so are other kinds of resources, wrote Sefer. And Moses accumulated a vast array of resources that allowed him to exercise power and influence over people, including elected officials. He began working in New York for Governor Al Smith in the 1920s. And gradually, Moses accumulated a number of different positions. At one point, he held simultaneously 12 different posts at the state and local level. His posts included president of the Long Island State Park Commission, chairman of the Triborough Bridge and Tunnel Authority, president of the World's Fair in the early 60s, all sorts of different offices and roles within the state and city. Interestingly, some of these positions didn't seem consequential at all at the time Moses took over in these roles. Each position, though, gave him power of the purse, i.e., access to public funds that he was in charge of spending. During the 30s, that was very important. Remember, Franklin Roosevelt, as president, beginning in 1933, launches the New Deal, a massive spending project in public works to try to reinvigorate the American economy in the midst of the Great Depression. So there were a lot of government funds available to people who would propose projects of various kinds. The idea was if you could propose some of these public works projects, you could employ people and help drive down the unemployment rate throughout the country. Moses understood that context and took advantage of it. He also took advantage of the notion of a public or quasi-public authority, an agency designed around a very specific task that was somewhat independent of state or local government. These quasi-public authorities existed in New York before Moses, but not much had been made of them. He saw them as potentially a powerful force in public life, and he was able to therefore use them to create projects without strong interference from publicly elected officials. Why is that? Well, through these authorities, he was able to collect revenue. For example, if he ran a bridge project, he was able to implement a toll, use the toll to fund the project and other related projects, and use the toll revenue to then go into the markets and issue bonds to raise money, to raise capital, to go off and invest and build other kinds of bridges, parks, roadways, and the like. That ability to raise revenue, both directly through tolls and the like, and fees, as well as through the ability to issue bonds, reduced his dependence on elected officials, reduced his dependence on general streams of tax revenue at the state and local level. By creating his own resource base, he accumulated a great deal of power. He also had knowledge that gave him power. What knowledge did Moses have that allowed him to exercise power and influence? Well, remember, he had a plan. He had a long-term plan, in fact, about what types of projects he was going to be starting in various parts of New York. That knowledge, remember, was highly valuable to private entrepreneurs. Remember, he was calling the shots. Moses was calling the shots on where the next road would be built, or park would be built, or a massive new building project. And therefore, lots of people were interested and even dependent on his plans. Unions, construction firms, lawyers, bankers, all sorts of folks whose livelihood now depended on working with Moses and working with him effectively. It was hard to be obstructionist or to fight Moses on one project because you might worry that he could exact revenge in some other project. You didn't want to get on his bad side because potentially if you stayed on his good side, you'd not only get to work on this project, but you'd get to work on a whole stream of other projects coming down the line. And that brought compliance on the part of all these folks that worked with him, the unions, the construction firms, the lawyers, and the like. Moses also understood the sunk cost effect. The sunk cost effect is the notion that once you've sunk a great deal of time, money, or other resources into a project, right, it can be hard to cut your losses. It can be hard to stop. You find yourself compelled to continue, and you will even throw good money after bad. Well, he knew that was fundamentally a trap of human nature, that we have a hard time cutting our losses and that we are likely to even escalate our commitment to courses of action if we've put a lot of money and other resources into it. And so he took advantage of that. As he once said, once you sink that first stake, they'll never make you pull it up. He knew it would be hard to undo a project once it was underway. So the key for him was to get enough support to get some funding to get started. And once he got started with a project, he knew he was in a much more powerful place. And he could get people to then help him continue with his vision. Well, that's really the end of our story, although I'll give you one kind of humorous historical anecdote, kind of odd one, in fact. And he very firmly believed in the automobile's transformative effect on society, and he built all of these roads and bridges throughout New York that we all know as we've traveled the city. Yet do you know that he never learned to drive a car himself? How interesting. So what do we learn from Robert Moses? Well, as Pfeffer has pointed out, and others who've written case studies about him, he really understood that you can accumulate power by going where your rivals are not. You know, he went and found offices and positions others weren't really interested in. He wasn't contending for elected public office. He was finding posts that others were in some way ignoring. And yet he was able to go there and build a power base before they paid too much attention and realized the power he had accumulated. He was able to gain control of key resources when others weren't paying attention. That's an important part of the story. It's also important to recognize that he understood the power of dependence. Many people became dependent on Moses over time, and dependence conveys power. As Pfeffer wrote, power is vested in us by the dependence of others. And boy, did Moses understand that. Someone else who understood the power that comes with accumulating resources, both financial, but also understood that allies are critical resources, is Lyndon Johnson. Lyndon Johnson, of course, is the president who took over when John Kennedy was assassinated. It's interesting to look at his career and how he accumulated power over time. Johnson first went to Washington, D.C. from Texas in 1931. He was the secretary to U.S. Representative Richard Kleberg. At the time, congressional secretaries belonged to an organization in Washington called the Little Congress. This was a group that met from time to time, and their meetings were lively. They, in some ways, were replicating the debates that were going on in Congress itself. This was a way for sort of people almost to train to become congressmen, if you will. They would listen to constituents, and they would discuss plans and ideas. Membership was limited to those who kind of worked around Congress. These were the secretaries of senators and representatives and the like. There were about 200 people that were members of the Little Congress back in the early 1930s. Most of them were college graduates. There were some that, were Phi Beta Kappas. Many had studied law on the side, and they were preparing themselves for an active career in politics someday. But by the time Johnson arrived in Washington, D.C., the Little Congress actually wasn't that active as an organization. It had a rich history, but there weren't nearly as many meetings taking place, not nearly as much lively debate. People were not engaged as much in this particular organization. Well, what did Johnson do? He promptly got himself elected as Speaker of the Little Congress. He started to schedule more frequent meetings. He invited prominent speakers from Congress and other agencies of the federal government to come address the group. He organized formal debates on top issues of the day in the 30s and straw polls as well. He would invite the press to come attend as the Little Congress met and had speakers presenting, or as members of the Little Congress were debating issues. Johnson's formidable power base, upon which he built his whole political career, going on to become Majority Leader of the Senate, then Vice President and President, it began with this seemingly inconsequential position. He, like Moses, saw that you might take a post that others really didn't think was that valuable and use it as the base upon which you could create and accumulate resources that will be valuable for years to come. Johnson understood that what he was doing in the 30s might not be that valuable to him in the moment, but he had long-term aspirations, and the allies that he accumulated during those early years would be helpful to him, he believed, for many decades. And in fact, that was indeed true. So, we have to understand that resources are critical to gaining power, but resources aren't just money. Resources include allies, and we can cultivate allies in a number of ways. Taking our cue from Johnson, he chose some pretty innovative ways to cultivate allies during those early years. What can we do as leaders to cultivate allies among our subordinates and peers, even perhaps our bosses, to help us get things done down the road? Well, certainly our hiring decisions are one way we can build allies, right? Hiring people, they then feel sort of obligated to you in some way. You gave them a chance, and they may become your ally. Promotions and appointments, likewise, can be a way of cultivating allies. Providing resources to people can be a way to cultivate them as a supporter, as someone who would like to work with you and support you. Doing someone a favor. If you help someone out in a crunch, there's sort of this reciprocity. They want to help you in return at some point. Making sure you share credit on major projects rather than hoarding all of the accolades for yourself. Sharing credit and really being generous in the way you do that can be a way of cultivating allies. And lastly, making others feel important, making them feel as though they've made a contribution or being recognized for it, that they've had a meaningful impact on something, can be a way of cultivating allies. Johnson was good at this, and he really began with some of his early relationships that he started out with when he was in Congress. I mean, one of the things he did was befriend Sam Rayburn at an early stage in his career. Rayburn was a lonely man, a bachelor, but he was a fellow Texan and obviously very powerful in Congress during the 30s and 40s. So Lyndon Johnson and his wife, Lady Bird Johnson, would invite Rayburn over to their home often. Here Johnson was much more junior in the overall scheme of things in Washington, yet he was reaching out to someone more senior, inviting them into his home and building a personal relationship. Through Rayburn, Johnson was able to come to know many powerful congressmen at an early age. And interestingly, we can see the effects of that relationship as we look at Johnson's actions through the years. In fact, even early on, as a secretary to Congressman Kleberg, we see the impact that his relationship to Rayburn had. People have noted that Johnson was able to get 50 patronage jobs for the office of Congressman Kleberg, a number that was 5 to 10 times as high as would be normal for a congressman of similar seniority and status. How did this secretary, Lyndon Johnson, who was very young and inexperienced, accumulate all these patronage jobs for the office of his congressman? Well, many people point to the fact that he had developed this ally in Sam Rayburn. He had reached out to him. So resources, money, allies, these are clearly aspects of how you gain power. But you also gain power through your position in a social network, right? People derive power based on where they sit relative to others in a network of relationships. If you're central in the workflow of an organization, you will have more power. That seems pretty simple. But Ronald Burt has made an important contribution in our understanding of social networks and who is really critical within a social network. And he's pointed out something very important in his theory of structural holes. A structural hole, what is that? Well, if you think about social networks, you have people who are very well connected, who have strong ties to one another. And so you may have a group of people who interact frequently, have strong relationships with one another. And then there may be a second group of people who also have strong ties to one another. But the two groups, by and large, don't know each other. Yet there may be one person who sort of spans the two groups and who can actually serve as a bridge between these two clusters. The gap between the two groups is described by Burt as a structural hole. The person who can span the gap is someone who can accumulate a great deal of power and influence. So as we think about our ability to exercise power, we have to ask ourselves, what are the key structural holes that we can span to help our organization and help ourselves in the exercise of power and influence? This brings us to some closing questions. First, I want to ask a simple question. Can a leader have too much power? Can power be detrimental to someone? Here I want to remind us of something called the planning fallacy. This is the notion that when individuals and groups try to plan complex projects, they often engage in this fallacy. They underestimate the true cost of the project. They underestimate what it will really take. They underestimate how long it will take to complete the project. They're pretty systematic about that. People have a hard time being accurate in their predictions when they plan complex endeavors. Well, new research by Mario Weick and Anna Gonote has found something quite fascinating with regard to people in positions of power. They found that they are particularly vulnerable to the planning fallacy. Well, why could that be? Well, perhaps it's because feeling powerful tends to get us to focus on getting what we want and ignoring the hurdles that may stand in our way. We may have so much self-confidence that we don't consider worst-case scenarios. In fact, we may obsessively focus only on the best case, thinking, of course, we can accomplish that. And so we may underestimate cost and schedule and not do a good job of accounting for what could go wrong. So powerful people can be vulnerable to the planning fallacy more so than others. That's a definite downside that we must consider. Of course, many people have asked, going all the way back to Lord Acton's famous quote, does power corrupt? I mean, he said, power corrupts, absolute power corrupts absolutely. Well, is that true? Can we see evidence, potentially, of these negative effects of power with leaders? Joris Lammers and Adam Galinsky conducted an interesting experiment to look at some of the negative dimensions of power. They examined people in 4 different states. First, people with high power who believed they had achieved that power legitimately. Secondly, people with low power who believed they were legitimately in that state. Then they looked at people with high power who believed they had achieved it illegitimately. And finally, people with low power who believed that that was an illegitimate situation. What did these scholars find? Interestingly, they found that high power individuals who believed they were entitled to their power readily engaged in acts of moral hypocrisy. It's very interesting. On the other hand, low power individuals did not engage in moral hypocrisy. In fact, they tended to be harsh judges of themselves. They were harder on themselves than they were on others when judging immoral behavior. Now here perhaps is the most interesting part of the Galinsky-Lammers study. They found that high-power individuals who believed they had been ascribed that power but were not really entitled to it actually behaved just like the low-power individuals did, harsher on themselves. What's the conclusion? Well, it turns out that the feeling of entitlement among those in power can actually be the fundamental driver of misbehavior in immoral behavior. It's not the power itself, but the feeling of entitlement, maybe when you don't deserve it, that can be a problem. Maybe we all knew this intuitively, but the stark findings here in this experiment provide us some persuasive empirical evidence. And they also show us this interesting harsher on ourselves impact that low-power individuals experience. Now remember, do powerful people recognize some of the negatives that they face given the influence that they have? And I would argue they don't sometimes see that they're more vulnerable to the planning fallacy or that maybe this sense of entitlement can have a negative effect. Why don't they? Well, it's because they may engage in positive illusions. They might be lousy self-evaluators. In fact, in the Heath brothers' book, Switch, about change, they describe the fact that many people are lousy self-evaluators. You know, that we may have a hard time recognizing our own weaknesses. In fact, the authors describe a startling experiment by psychologists Peter Borcono and Annette Liebler. They called it the fake weatherman study. The scholars brought a fake weatherman into a room full of people and got that person to give a 90-second weather report. And then the folks in the room had to guess the weather reporter's IQ. They also asked the fake weatherman to guess his own IQ. What did they find? Amazingly, the observers offered far more accurate predictions than the weathermen themselves, even though they knew nothing else about these complete strangers. The inaccuracy of the weathermen's self-evaluations demonstrates the power of positive illusion. We are lousy self-evaluators. And I would argue that lousy self-evaluation can be a real problem for people in positions of power, a watch-out situation for all leaders. So, what have we learned here? We've learned that there are many sources of power, not just formal authority, and that the person with the gold makes the rules, that resources are key, and those resources include not just money but allies. That social networks are critical, and where you sit in a social network can convey power. And you can and should begin to build power long before you take on high leadership positions and achieve formal authority. And lastly, we've learned there's certainly some negatives to the accumulation and exercise of power.